I want to go back to Capitol Hill now. House Republicans have just decided their candidate for Speaker. Republicans have chosen Minnesota Congressman and House Majority Whip Tom Emmer as their third Speaker designate since Kevin McCarthy's historic vacating the seat. And Emmer will now have to win a majority vote on the House floor to secure the gavel. So we started 7-8 people today. There was even a name thrown into one of the later votes. Austin Scott came back. And remember last week, a lot of people were scratching there, well, who is Congressman Austin Scott? Well, everybody knows him now. He was cut out about an hour ago and then dwindled to 4 and then to 2. And now the final tally, Emmer, 117 votes. Johnson, 97. And then now the category of others. Remember, Byron Donalds of Florida had gotten 32 votes on the last one last hour. And then one person voting present. You know, Kayleigh, what's really interesting about this was how quickly they got down to this. And there were reports that Emmer might have had a Donald Trump problem, that he wasn't quite there. How could that have made a difference? Do you think it did?
I don't think it made a difference here. It could have, however, it did not. That was the criticism from some on the right. Is he sufficiently supportive of the former president, the titular leader of the party? He got a majority of the majority, 117 of a 200, I think it's 24-member delegation. But that's not enough to win on the House floor. We need to solve this, Republicans. And we need to solve it today. There's so much that could be done. There could be a positive agenda to contrast with the sitting president, Republican foreign policy versus Biden's. We can't do it without a House Speaker. Emmer was the person who was expected to get this. He's third in position in leadership. I hope he can bring over the Freedom Caucus in the 8, as well as the moderates, because boy, do we need it as Republicans. This is a pretty sad showing.
I'm going to ask our team, can we quickly put up that tally again, any kind of way on the screen? Just tell me when you have it, because what Kayleigh is saying is true. I mean, if you added it up last hour, they only had 212. But here, we'll just add quickly. I'm just curious, you know, if they were to hold this vote right now, and I'm going to add them up, they're at, yes, I know, I'm not that fast. They're still short, as Kayleigh has said. So what has to happen now? Is this like a horse trade where everybody goes around and they're at 220?
Well, many of them vowed
They're at 220. Do they stay that way now?
Many of the Republicans vowed to coalesce after this vote. So I certainly hope that's the case, because what we've seen on the House floor is the closest person to the speakership is Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader.
Well, yeah, he had 212. I believe, when they were looking at Jim Jordan, and he went down from 200 to 199. So, I mean, Hakeem Jeffries was getting bigger in the numbers.
Exactly right. And they say, Republicans, if this does not go through, if they do not get Tom Emmer across the finish line, that then they would look at Speaker Pro Tem, empowering the current Speaker Pro Tem McHenry. But unclear if he even wants the job, and who would want the job at this point.
Trump for Speaker. I'm just saying it. I'm just saying it.
You're not the only one saying
So
it.
they're not going to vote against him on the record. Like, it's kind of a joke, but it's kind of not. Like, the establishment fears going on the record against President Trump.
Why?
Put him on there because
the moderates would never go for that.
We'll see. That's how you lose a primary. I mean, look at the 2020 or 22 midterms when the impeachment voters, you know, they got bounced out in primaries. Not all of them, but some.
I hear you, but if they didn't go for Jim Jordan, I don't think they'll go for the former.
So who's it going to be?
Well, let's hope Tom Emmer can get across the finish line.
Well, and I'm curious too, Emily, how much does it hurt those on the far right that Jim Jordan couldn't make it through? Like this was really a push, as you know, led by Matt Gaetz, but there were others. Obviously, there were 8 in total who wanted Kevin McCarthy out. How does this, you know, maybe tell us how much power they have left in the House? They couldn't get their person through.
Right. I think there's sort of 2 arguments that I'm hearing about that small minority group. One of which is essentially that they blew up, they ousted McCarthy in that historic vacating, as you called it. And then they didn't have a secondary plan. They didn't have a plan of who then would assume leadership. So it sort of blew up in their face. They said that they were trying to dispel chaos. Well, look what we have right here. So I think there was an absolute gutting of any type of respect, a modicum of respect that people might have had, other than, frankly, a sort of public scoffing that we've seen carry through. And then the second lens, the second argument, is the fact that, well, now might this carry into the Trump argument, and that perhaps now they will garner some power if they whip themselves, no pun intended, based on Emmer's position, that that he is the, that Trump does not like him, does not endorse him, will that lead to a big enough faction? We talked about this on Fox News Sunday with Shannon on Sunday, where that unity pledge that some of them signed, the whole point is, I made, who cares? Shouldn't the unity pledge have been their oath that they took when they swore to serve their constituents and not themselves?
Interesting.
And as Kim Strasser wrote for the Wall Street Journal, frankly, as what we are learning here is not necessarily, or in regards to the math, it's not necessarily that there's a strong majority. It's that every person on there is their own royalty, their own prince or their own princess, because clearly that tiny little faction had enough power, as you called it, to blow everything up. It bears worth repeating. I'm sure everyone knows this. Emmer is considered widely respected for his fundraising ability, as we know, for the fact that perhaps given his whip position, the minority whip position, perhaps he will have a higher consensus view that it will ultimately be successful. But to Kayleigh's point, they need to get it together.
Yeah, all right. Thank you to the team for getting those numbers up, because I wanted people to see that if you add up all those numbers, you get to 220. But who knows if those people are going to stick together for one candidate, as in Emmer. So do you then begin to ask Democrats to come on board? And are there any who would? I would imagine that number is so slim you can't see it. Senior congressional correspondent Chad Pergram is standing by. Chad, thank you for sticking with us basically for 2 hours on this. So this got small quickly, just in 45 minutes. Are you hearing anything that really drove it to Emmer?
Well, it was always believed that Tom Emmer certainly had most of the votes here. You know, he was in leadership. He was the majority whip. So he kind of had an inside track there. There were some questions about his allegiance to former President Trump, but he put up a bigger number than certainly Steve Scalise did a couple of weeks ago. But it wasn't a gigantic number. This is still a pretty deeply divided caucus. And I always say it's about the math. I want to point to the 6 members who voted for other or present. That's enough to tank this on the floor unless they commit to somebody. Keep in mind, they have to bring all these people who voted for Mike Johnson on board here. That's unclear. This is where Mike Flood, the Republican representative from Nebraska yesterday, he asked all the candidates, there were 9 at one point yesterday, to sign a unity pledge that they would agree to support whoever the nominee was coming out of the conference. So right now what's happening is our Republicans are deciding whether or not they want to go to the floor. They have a nominee here, and they want to say, okay, is this going to be sufficient? Because the thing that they loathe the most, the thing that they are most concerned about, is going to the floor again and losing. Now, you alluded to the role of the Democrats in this process. There was a bit of chatter here on Capitol Hill this morning when Dean Phillips, Democrat from Minnesota, indicated that he might vote present. If you have members who vote present, what happens, and maybe some of these Republicans, that lowers the threshold, because what is the bar? Somebody needs to win. If they're going to be the winner, they need to have an outright majority of all candidates casting ballots for somebody by name. So if you're voting present, that does not count against the grand total. So that could provide a lower threshold for a successful candidate in a potential floor vote there. So if people vote present, that might actually help Tom Emmer if he's able to bring some of these conservatives on board who voted for Mike Johnson, the Republican from Louisiana. But right now, we still have a pretty fractured conference. I mean, there's not that many votes. Only 20 ballots separating Mike Johnson and Tom Emmer here. That is significant at this stage, the fact that you didn't have a far breakaway here for Tom Emmer. In fact, some people kept saying to me, in all the ballots throughout the morning, Tom Emmer was winning, but he never put up a substantial total that was really knocking everybody out of the park. Harris?
You know what? I'm taking notes as you're talking, and I caught that. So there's one present. And what you're saying is if Dems like Dean Phillips come on and they continue to vote present, do we know who no, we can't know. It's a closed ballot, so we don't know who the one present was.
That's right.
But if that continues to happen, it lowers the threshold. So, in fact, Democrats could help. And I'm so glad you explained that. But, no one does anything for nothing. So what do they want?
Well, the question right now is, I think they want a speaker. I mean, that's the main thing here, and that's kind of what Dean Phillips had intimated. Pete Aguilar, the chairman of the Democratic caucus, said they hadn't had any conversations with Dean Phillips about this. This wasn't like a conference position on the Democratic side of the aisle or anything like that.
Gotcha.
But again, you don't really know how everybody is going to vote until they call those names and they vote on the floor, which they may not do today necessarily.
Chad Pergram, thank you. We have a Speaker of the House designate. someone who could step in potentially if he can get the votes into the vacated seat of former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. You bringing us the breaking news. We'll come back to you this hour as the news warrants. When do we know, and maybe you said it and we missed it, but when do we know next steps?
Well, that's what they're trying to sort out right now. If they feel they have the votes, they would go to the floor. This is what you always do on Capitol Hill. If you think you have the votes and you think you can win, you go to the floor. You don't sit around and say, let's vote at 3 o'clock on Tuesday or something like that. No, no, no. If you have the votes you think you can win on the floor, you vote. We did hear from Ralph Norman, a Republican congressman from South Carolina this morning, who thought that the Freedom Caucus would need to have a meeting, at least from their perspective, before they would go to the floor and vote. And you might have to have some whipping going on here where Tom Emmer, as the nominee, he is the whip, needs to make sure that he has the votes lined up. I mean, if you're the whip, you know, you're supposed to be able to count the votes right on a vote on the floor. And, you know, sometimes that's been an Achilles heel for Republicans lately.
Yeah, you know who did it well? Boy, she could count votes, Nancy Pelosi. And Republicans watch that from across the aisle with awe and frustration sometimes. We're hearing that there might be two factions. In fact, Morgan Ortagus was just mentioning there might be two factions already moving for and against Emmer. We'll cover this stem to stern and appreciate your great reporting as always, Chad Pergram.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.